As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So in his speech, President Biden attempted to draw comparisons between Hamas and Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said, quote, "Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy. Completely annihilate it," end quote. So the president claimed that it was America's duty to get involved in these foreign wars and that it would keep Americans safe, even though the proxy war in Ukraine is making nuclear war much more likely. And this U.S. support for what Israel's doing in Gaza, and we'll get into in more stories here. I mean, there's a real risk here of the U.S. being dragged into an all-out war with American troops fighting and dying. Some are already being injured because of what's going on. So I'll read this one quote from Biden here, basically how he wrapped up this speech that he gave. He said, quote, "American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep Americans safe. American values are what make us a partner nation you want to work with. To put all that at risk, we walk away from Ukraine. We turn our backs on Israel. It's just not worth it. That's why tomorrow I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine," end quote. So he is all in on backing these two wars. So Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Thursday told Israeli troops to be ready to invade Gaza as Israeli airstrikes continue to pound the besieged enclave. Gallant told troops near the Gaza border, quote, "Whoever sees Gaza from afar now will see it from the inside, I promise you. It might take a week, a month, 2 months until we destroy them," end quote. Other Israeli officials addressed troops near Gaza and also signaled that an invasion would happen soon. Major General Yaron Finkelman, he's the head of Israel's Southern Command. He said, quote, "Now the maneuver is going to move the fighting to their territory. We are going to beat them in their territory. It's going to be difficult, long, and intense," end quote. So that's the message that we're hearing from these Israeli officials, is that this is going to take a long time. That's what they told Biden while he was in Israel. Some are even saying it could take years. So this is what Biden's looking at supporting and fueling. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told a group of soldiers that they would be victorious. He said, quote, "We are going to win with all our might. All of Israel is behind you, and we are going to heavily strike our enemies so that we can achieve victory," end quote. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it is based on this press conference that was held by Admiral John C. Aquilino. He is the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So he's the top military commander for the region there. And also Eli Ratner, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. And Ratner is a very serious China hawk. I remember when the transition was happening, when the Biden administration was coming in, the fact that they were including Ratner, initially he was a special advisor to Lloyd Austin, was a sign that they were going to be very hawkish on China, and they have been. And so this press conference was about these, they're accusing China of unsafe, unprofessional, and risky encounters over the South China Sea and the East China Sea. They're saying that there is 180 instances of Chinese and American planes having these encounters in the past, I believe, 2 years. So, remember, this is over waters very close to China. And the fact that there's 180 of these just shows how much the U.S. flies around there. I mean, they do thousands of surveillance flights over the South China Sea, the East China Sea every year. I mean, could you imagine if Chinese spy planes were just constantly flying in, the Gulf, say the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean? I mean, and China has been getting fed up with it, and I think that's why we're seeing more. You see some of the footage, they get close to the American planes. So what these guys are saying is that they were asked at this press conference, can you support Ukraine, Israel, and still be ready to fight China in the region? So Aquilino said, quote, "What I'll tell you is I haven't had one piece of equipment or force structure depart. The U.S. is a global power, and that means we can deliver effects and execute our deterrence responsibilities across the globe. But I don't think any other nation can do this at this time, but the U.S. can. Indo-Pacific Command prepares every day to ensure we execute both of the missions the Secretary gave me. Number one, to prevent conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And number two, if mission one fails, be prepared to fight and win," end quote. So the Joe Biden administration eased some sanctions on Venezuela's energy and gold sectors after President Nicolas Maduro reached an agreement with the opposition to hold elections next year. And Kyle mentions at the same time, the U.S. resumed deporting Venezuelan migrants back to Venezuela. So they're easing some sanctions. So the Venezuela policy was a total disaster that Trump really ramped up, especially in 2019 when the U.S. recognized Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, even though he was not the president. They backed a very failed coup and sanctioned, Venezuela about as much as they can sanction them. And I know the Biden administration issued some limited license for oil pumping earlier this year, but this seems a little more significant than that. So I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully keep moving in this direction and lifting sanctions. Because usually once they sanction the countries, it's very hard to get them removed.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
So, how do they say it on CNBC? Stocks slid Thursday as Wall Street parsed commentary from Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. So this is the language that they use. Stocks slid as Wall Street parsed commentary. And people don't like the way I speak. Listening to more fucking bullshit coming out of Powell's mouth. The clown boy that said that there was no inflation, it was only temporary and transitory. And these are the freaks running the show. It's a fucking corporation that shouldn't be here, the Federal Reserve. Got it? I'm an American. I don't believe in the Federal Reserve. The banksters have taken over. And the shithead that's our Treasury Secretary is the former fucking head of the Federal Reserve. Oh, and she's screaming out, by the way, more, more, war. We could keep sending weapons for war for Israel and Ukraine. Yeah, banksters, bankster, bandits. Calm down, Salenti. Bend over and take the shit like the rest of the people do. The majority, not the irate tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men, of which I am. Moving on. Dow closed down 212 points. Powell said inflation was still too high. Hey, fuckface, you said there was no inflation back when we were saying there was inflation. Oh, you forgot? You said it was temporary, then transitory, as well as the other clown over there in the ECB. How about, oh, yeah, Christine Lagarde, if only women were in charge. Yeah. No, there's no inflation. You know what the fuck you're talking about? We could create this horror by having negative and zero interest rate policy and having the governments dump all the fucking money they want into the system to artificially prop it up to fight the COVID war. Yep. Anyway. Incoming data, he says, over recent months show ongoing progress toward both of our dual mandates. Maximum employment is blah, 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 blah. But in any case, inflation is still too high. And who are they blaming? Oh, the plantation workers of Slavelandia. That's right. Fact after fact, week after week, in your Trends Journal, blaming rising wages. So, investors appear to, so they're betting 99% is saying that they're going to hold the rates where they are. The economy is going to drag down and inflation is going to keep going up. Home foreclosures are on an upward swing nationwide. Yep, they're only up 34% from the last year. Now you go back to our Trends Journal. I think this is the 58th week we've been putting the layoffs going on. So now people are losing their jobs. They bought all these homes. They can't afford to pay their loans, their mortgages. You're going to see more foreclosures. But don't worry, the bigs will buy them all up. Middle East turmoil weighs on ECB ahead of rate decision. Taking into account the fact that the Eurozone continues to be a large net energy importer, is likely to have, stagflationary impacts if it becomes a problem. This is according to, who is this guy from the central bank? Yanis Stornaris. He told this to the Financial Times. No, not stagflation, dragflation. Can't say drag, take it easy. And again, the oil prices, what are they now? We got Brent crude over $93 a barrel. We warned about this, and here's the reality. If Brent crude hits $130 a barrel, kiss the economy globally and the equity markets goodbye. But don't worry about it. When all else fails, they take you to war. We warned World War III already began with the Ukraine war, and now the Middle East war. Again, that's your Trends Journal magazine cover 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine on February 22nd. They invaded on February 24th, 2022. We are on the verge of nuclear annihilation. Wall Street concerns over swelling U.S. debt put Fed in tight spot. Yeah, no kidding. Fed in tight spot. Read Gregory Mannarino's articles in this week's Trends Journal. And we've been writing about this a long time. And inflation isn't going down. UK inflation ends string of declines. What string of declines? This is the fucking bullshit that they put out there. That's Trader's Choice where you go to for Mannarino. This is from the New York Times. It's at 6.7%. It went from 6.8, 6.7, a tenth of a percent, and they called it a decline last time. And now it's back to where it was. It's still at 6.7%. The people are suffering. Trips to Israel are nothing new for New York leaders. What leader? Leader? How can you call these little scumbags leader? I want to make this clear. I was not put on this earth to be led by anyone. And all you fuck faces who call these people leaders, you got it backwards. They're public servants. Capiche? Public servants. They serve the public. All they're fucking interested is keeping their political jobs because they never work a fucking day in their life and steal all the money that they can in the name of campaign contributions.
In 2006, columnist Taki Theodorakopoulos warned in The American Conservative of the clean break plan to aggressively remake the strategic environments of Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. So when there are so many complex aspects of this war, it's worth tracking the observable trend towards potential profiteering and other agenda. People in Congress purchasing stocks and shares in weapons manufacturers. Have a look at this on X from Unusual Wales. And this ongoing narrative around attacking Iran. Curious. So what are the potential consequences for any US involvement in a potential war with Iran? And escalating a regionalized conflagration, tragic, awful, though that is in itself, into something that has potential global connotations and fits into the narrative of forever wars that we've been discussing since the conflict between Ukraine and Russia escalated, and the potential even for a war with China around the issue of Taiwan. Is this potentially a component of that? These calls for attacking Iran risk an escalation that could entrench the US in another forever war. Nearly 20 years after the invasion of Iraq, it is commonly understood as a historic mistake of US foreign policy. The push for another disastrous war in the Middle East appears to be the real intention of hawkish voices. That's what we're asking. What is the real intention? Is it support and solidarity, or is it exploitation? Witnessing the death and devastation in Ukraine and concerns over nuclear escalation with Russia, it is all the more crucial to weigh the consequences of war. This is not to mention the global impact of such conflicts, as can be seen in rising food and energy costs, a looming global food crisis that will starve many already facing food insecurity around the world, and inflation in the United States that is heavily impacting the lives of American workers. It's difficult to make such arguments from the perspective of people directly affected by this terrible conflict, but when it comes to US involvement and the potential motivation behind the advocacy of many of these plainly hawkish figures, is something that is worth keeping an eye on. Would you agree? A war with Iran will likely worsen these conditions, especially the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz in the Gulf. In fact, American public opinion is against more wars, which is why both the Biden and Trump administrations promised to end endless war, in what has become a popular catchphrase in US political discourse. It's curious to watch Biden claiming that he advocates for global peace and will do anything he can, and the reason he should run as president in 2024 is because imagine we could bring about world peace, bring a peaceful conclusion to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and bring about peace in the Middle East. It doesn't seem that the actions, policy, and funding, broadly speaking, are heading in the direction of peace or ending endless wars. Thus, even in a war effort that Americans support, like Ukraine, the majority do not want the US to risk war with Russia. And it appears that opinion is changing on that issue. Is that why, do you imagine, that the current conflict in the Middle East is being bundled together with that less popular conflict, which is less popular not because of humanitarian reasons, not because of a lack of compassion, but the observable evidence that the approach is not working, that the counteroffensive failed, that many people are beginning to question what the motivations for funding that war are, and many people are also questioning how that war began. This is not surprising, given the failures of US militarism, most notably the swift takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban after 20 years of war, and the enormous cost of these conflicts to American taxpayers as many struggle at home. Julian Assange famously said that you understand why the Afghanistan war went on for so long when you recognise that it wasn't a war that they wanted to end, it was a war that they wanted to sustain, and that the function of such wars is to take money from public hands and to put them into the hands of private companies. And we can see that trillions have subsequently gone from American taxpayers' pockets into the military-industrial complex. This is not about supporting the troops or ensuring that the American military are well supported as they conduct selfless, dangerous, potentially lethal work on the behalf of patriotism, but ultimately ends up being profitable to military-industrial complex partners of the Pentagon who notably cannot pass an audit. That means it's not possible for them to account for their expenditure or their profiting. And as you know, some people have contested that up to 70% of weaponry intended for Ukraine ended up elsewhere. A war with Iran, a country with a larger population than Iraq and Afghanistan combined, and a stronger position in the region in the wake of US wars, would be another historic blunder with far worse outcomes than we have already seen. No sensible person would comment on Israel's position and potential appetite for ongoing conflict after these horrific attacks. It would seem insensitive to do so, but US involvement in a war with Iran and escalation of these tensions has to be scrutinized, and in particular, the motivations would have to be understood. You'd have to be certain that the motivation was humanitarianism, solidarity, righteousness, and if there were questions about those motivations, it would certainly be prudent, I would think, to ask them. Any such war would be a calamity, further destabilizing oil prices and adding to the economic havoc from the war in Ukraine that's already caused much secondary human suffering, while potentially creating the conditions for a much bigger and more dangerous confrontation. Iran's deepening alliance with Russia, after all, could draw Moscow into the war, turning the country into the second front of a global proxy battle between two nuclear superpowers, the United States and Russia. These certainly seem like considerations that are worth discussing and understanding. That's why I think the rhetoric of politicians like Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley has to be scrutinised. As I understand, these are not people that are personally affected by a horrific conflict. They are people that potentially have motivations beyond the deep grief and suffering that region is defined by. We're not nearly there yet, but it's incumbent on all peace-loving people in the United States to work now proactively to stop this scenario coming to pass. Not just to ensure the past year's rhetoric about illegal wars, imperialism, human rights and international law isn't mere hollow, cynical posturing, but to prevent even more needless death and suffering.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
That because the people of Gaza elected Hamas, they for now they're as guilty as their government is. And it's like you see that and you're like, okay, this is the exact line of logic that Osama bin Laden had. This was literally his argument, was that American civilians are fair game because they have elections and they voted in these policies. And so you're as responsible as they are. There's this really crazy, similar thinking on both sides. And you see where there's an event where a bunch of innocent people die in Israel. And the immediate response is like, well, we got to go kill a whole bunch of people over there. And it just seems to me that seems to be very similar to the mindset of Hamas, that innocent people have been dying over here. And so, of course, we've got to go do something. We've got to take a military action, but they don't have a military. So their weapon is terrorism. It's wild to see this all happening again.
Well, and I think one of the things that's also very important to emphasize is, regardless of what you think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, everyone understands, everybody has always acknowledged that there is a gigantic problem. Namely, that you have millions of Palestinians living in a space that they don't self-govern. The Israelis, it is true, in 2005, withdrew their troops from Gaza, not from the West Bank, which they continue to occupy, but they withdrew their troops from Gaza. They still, however, control the airspace and the sea lanes and the land borders of Gaza, with the exception that Egypt has a shared border with Gaza that they also keep closed. So Israel controls what goes into Gaza, what comes out of Gaza. They bombed the Gazan airport, the only airport in Gaza City, which means that, again, there are millions of people, 2.2 million people who live in the Gaza Strip who cannot leave. These people are 20 and 25 years old. They have dreams of going to visit places, and they are trapped physically inside. They cannot leave Gaza. And then you have the people in the West Bank who are also number in the millions who are occupied. And just last month, not, Angela Davis or, Noam Chomsky, but the former head of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, said that Israel is now essentially the equivalent of an apartheid state, the way that South Africa was, because you have millions and millions of people who live in the same territory, who have no political rights. This is not, again, some left-wing anti-Israeli activists saying it, and other Israeli officials have warned of this as well. So the question then becomes, well, if you're Palestinian and you want self-governance, how do you fight against that? I think we can all agree that going into civilian territories and civilian events that are civilians, to just gunning people down and massacring civilians, not as collateral damage, but deliberately, has to be morally indefensible in all cases. You have to have that line. The interesting thing, though, Dave, is prior to this attack, they've tried many other things. For example, they wanted to do what Black South Africans did to get political rights, which was to inspire and to call upon a worldwide boycott of Israel as a way of pressuring Israel to end the occupation. And you know what happened? People in the West, almost in every mainstream political party, not only denounced that boycott movement as anti-Semitic, but actually enacted laws that made it illegal to boycott to support a boycott of Israel on the grounds that it was anti-Semitic. So that was a case of a nonviolent protest, a nonviolent resistance movement that was deemed not just bigoted, but illegal. There are red states in the United States that enacted laws saying, if you want to have a contract with the government, with the United States government or with the state of Texas, you have to sign a vow that you do not support a boycott of Israel. You're free to support a boycott of any other country. So you're permitted to boycott Peru or South Korea. You're permitted to boycott Mississippi or Idaho. You just can't boycott Israel. So they banished the nonviolent attempts to change the situation there and restore political rights to Palestinians. And now there's, of course, saying violence is also unacceptable. The point, though, that you raise, I think, is the crucial one, which is this dehumanization. You know, obviously, there's been a lot of accusations about my own political trajectory and the fact that a lot of people on the left or American liberals think I'm more sympathetic to Donald Trump than they think it's warranted. In fact, they think he's Adolf Hitler. It's kind of a litmus test for them, how you feel about Donald Trump, which is why all of those neocons who actually ushered in the Iraq War, one of the greatest political crimes of our lifetime, are not just tolerated, but welcomed and celebrated. I mean, half the people on MSNBC are people who worked for George Bush's administration or who were in the media at the time leading the way to invade Iraq or to institute a torture regime. All of that is forgotten. Now, the reason why I think that's so crucial is because what happens in war is all of these instincts that we do have within us as human animals, this kind of savagery and barbarism that we needed to survive over thousands of years, always are lurking within us. And nothing stimulates it more easily and more alarmingly than war. And what you're seeing now is the proof of that, this kind of dehumanization that instantaneously emerges. You know, if you go back and you look at the Vietnam War, there's these infamous videos of General William Westmoreland, who was the chief commander in Vietnam, who was trying to tell Americans who were horrified by the number of deaths of Vietnamese civilians for which we were responsible in that war. There were several videos where he would say things like, you don't understand the Asian mind. You don't understand the Asian makeup. They don't feel lost the way we feel lost. They don't mourn and grieve their loved ones the way that we do. There's always this attempt to suggest that whoever we are going to kill is not really human. And you are absolutely seeing that now. Some of the rhetoric, not from fringe places, but mainstream ones, about how Palestinians are animals. The Israelis are cutting off their access to clean drinking water and to food, starving and keeping water away from them to death in order to force them to submit this kind of collective punishment that the Nuremberg trials prohibited. This kind of dehumanization of saying that all Palestinian lives are of lesser value than Western lives, there's few things more dangerous than that. And yet that is absolutely the prevailing sentiment right now. And ordinarily the capacity to reason that we would embrace to avoid that is being drowned out by the intensity of these emotions that are being deliberately stoked and nurtured and strengthened all the time.
Don't tread on us.
What I love about the book is how in such a brief amount of time, you're able to just take a knife to the heart of something like intellectual property, just a belief that's sort of like exposing a fish to water. We all assume we have property rights, you have intellectual property rights, and that's that. So what I would like you to do is we are going to take the lesson from Henry Hazlitt that economics is about not just the short-term consequences on one group, but the long-term consequences on all groups of a given policy. So when it comes to embracing the idea of intellectual property, walk us through the potential downsides and the deontological approach that you give in your book. I believe it is the first one, Libertarian Voluntarism on Intellectual Property.
So, when it comes to thinking through that, you just have to think about property rights at the bare bones, right? What makes ethical property rights? And when we're talking about our perspective here, that is the libertarian voluntarist perspective, and sometimes tying in the Austrian's perspective here, we're talking about physicality and scarcity, right? Because again, what we're worried about when it comes to assigning these things is that you are not deprived of the physical things that you have. No one's going to come take an apple as you're about to eat it and be like, oh no, I can't eat that apple. So where things lack the ability to have scarcity over, right? If someone could, have an apple in their hand and someone through some magical machine, right? You think Star Trek or something like that, and they're able to copy your apple perfectly, but they don't deprive you of it, right? You haven't had that apple taken out of your hand. They're able to somehow replicate that in a machine elsewhere, but you haven't been deprived of that. So intellectual property here means that someone else gets to control your physical property, your apple, just by virtue of saying, well, I happen to have this thing first. And, for example, if someone were to make a drawing, like let's just say, this comic book here, right? I have this artwork, and if someone were to go with their own pencil and paper and to draw this exact same thing, I wouldn't have a right to say, well, you can't fashion your property, which again, it's not my pencil, it's not my paper. I wouldn't have the right to say, oh, well, you can't fashion it like this cover, because that would be me saying, oh, I get to control how you form your totally independent property. And to have this intellectual property paradigm within the state means the government is going to threaten that person with violent force for doing that, for using what is totally their own physical property, the pencil and paper, to make something that is in similitude to this. And so that's really where we're at the core, is that we reject this idea that just because someone makes their property, their physically owned independent property, in similitude to something that you may have made, that doesn't merit the initiation of force against them to stop them. And so when it comes to creativity and innovation and things like that, we have to think outside of the intellectual property paradigm in order to have that done ethically. You really have to have a product offering off of that in customer service and other things that make you stand out. You're not going to just be able to stand out just by resting on the idea and the first iteration of that alone. So, fundamentally, that's just all it boils down to is we have this ethical principle that, hey, you can't control how other people fashion their property. And now you just have to think, okay, within the context of that ethical confine, how do you innovate and how do you provide value to others in an ethical way? And once you have that grounded, it's not that crazy and everything else kind of falls into place.
In book 1 on page 62, you ask the vitally important question, compared to what? When having philosophical discussions or even just everyday empirical discussions, why is it important to ask compared to what? And please provide us with an example.
Sure. So compared to what, I think one of the people who I especially think about this whenever I hear the term is, Stefan Molyneux from back in the day, doing that philosophical deep thinking of the compared to what's, to remember that we are not in this world where every single perfection about everything is written in the stars for us, right? We are not told here's what moral ethical behavior is by default. We're not told here's how all of science works. We're not told here's how all of math works. We're in a constant state of discovery and learning and evolving and adapting. And because of that, sometimes people will critique what your position is, even if your position may not necessarily be the end all be all of solutions. They might critique you, but then their own position is much worse or more vile in terms of the harms caused, against people, right? So you sometimes have to be like, okay, there could be critiques about what I am saying potentially, but compared to what, as in what are you advocating for? And a lot of times this comes into play when we're talking about the nature of statism, right? Because we're often thinking in terms of state violence. We're thinking about how the state is actually operating and what they're doing compared to what could be done if that wasn't the means of funding things, or that wasn't the means of orchestrating, human behavior. And so that's a lot of the times what we're trying to get people to wrestle away from is this idea, the only way to do this thing is the state. And you're like, oh, well, how will that ever arise? They'll just be warlords and this or that. And it's like, no, here's how roads can be funded privately and can be made, right? It's not like, oh, okay, that's not possible to make roads, right? So, you have to sit there and get people to walk through those things and say, okay, here's how you're advocating for things to be funded and things to be orchestrated, and what are the actual specifics in terms of what each person's doing to get there. And they say, okay, well, what if we, in the comparative, were to try to achieve that without all the threats of force and violence and these automatic mandatory takings that end up being used to fund massive wars over in the Middle East and spending trillions of dollars on things that people truly don't want to enrich, those in power, right? So it's just a great discourse to have on anything that you want to talk about. And it obviously is very easy to show, if you get a little versed in some of the details, how much the government actually causes harm in the comparative, especially for interventions and, what was before they intervened, or in places where, you can actually see where the government has gotten out of it in some miraculous way and how things have flourished. So I like to think about it like that.
What's wrong with government today?
Well, we have an overreaching central government, to say the least. I mean, we saw this with COVID and how all these dictates got pushed down into the states and local level, a complete arbitrary imposition of lockdowns and so forth, masking of children, just unbelievable stuff. And, so we're looking at a federal hegemon that has to be undone. We must get the power away from the federal government and vest it in the people.
Is it reasonable to expect, when we have a federal government that thinks it can right any wrong and regulate any behavior and tax any event and insinuate itself into any process and fight any war, that we could restrain the government, or, as Jefferson once said, chain it down to the Constitution?
Yes, I think we can starve it. We're going to have to starve it somehow. And I think, as I'll talk about later, I think this has to do with taking over our governments locally, taking over the township city halls, taking over the school boards, taking over the sheriffs and police. We need to get control at the local level. They have to drive their imperatives down into the fabric of society at the local level. And this is our only opportunity right now for resisting this regime.
If you are center stage in the fall of 2024, and if you're asked, what will you do to shrink the government down to the size mandated and theoretically restrained, by the Constitution, how would you answer that question, Professor Rector?
Of course, I would audit and abolish the Fed, the Federal Reserve, which is a counterfeiting organization that has a monopoly on money, that lends the U.S. government money on interest that's made up out of thin air. It's a complete fraud. It has to be dismissed and gotten away with. It's got to be completely abolished.
Would you maintain a standing army, or would you go back to the Jeffersonian model of only standing officers, but the regular army, like the Israelis, are citizen soldiers.
Well, in an ideal world, we'd have nothing but private property, and then you'd have private property protection by private agencies, etc. But we don't live in that world. I would pull all the troops out of all 800, however many bases.
903 at last count.
Yeah, 903 bases. They would all be pulled home. Then you'd have to look at what we need for self-defense, and that's all that would remain. We should have nothing but a defensive military. This empire regime that we've attempted to foist on the world for all these years has failed, and it's bound to fail. It has no hope, and we've got to resume pulling back and getting our troops completely out of these bases and across the world, especially theaters of conflict.
Suppose we all began using a Bitcoin or banana peels or whatever we want to use as means of a currency. What would become of the central bank and its ability to touch deeply into our bank accounts?
Right. This would be an implosion if we had this movement go very wide and across the country. We would see an implosion of the Federal Reserve by virtue of the fact that their de facto monopoly over money would be over. This is very much a project that is possible, and I'm not adjudicating exactly which currencies people use. This would be up to the networks that they're in. It could be gold-based. It could be gold leafs. It could be, as you said, banana peels, whatever people will approve of and stake their word on. That's what can count in a network of producers and consumers.
That he's asking the Congress for $100 billion with a B dollars to fund the war in Ukraine, to fund the Israelis as they fight off the monsters from Hamas, to fund whoever is running Taiwan, and to build a border wall. Why is that a bad idea?
This is a total outrage. I mean, the U.S. has no money. First of all, we don't have any money. It's all fictitious. And we must stop sending money and military aid and arms to these and other nations. This is an outrage. We are destroying the country. Internally, it's falling into pieces while we fund all these wars in Ukraine, in Israel, and now the idea of funding Taiwan in advance of any kind of Chinese incursion on them. So he's trying to float this omnibus bill that would fund all three theaters with military aid. And this is, what he's hoping for is what he calls jamming the far right by inserting Israeli aid into the package that includes Ukraine aid. And really, this is also jamming the left, if you will, too, because there are leftists that want to support Ukraine, but not Israel. I mean, they're both hypocrites, by the way. And I think it's outrageous how the right wing's part of it has been folded back into the neocon tent by virtue of this Israeli conflict. I mean, these people have no principles, apparently.
What is the American attraction to war?
That's a great question. And I think, look, the idea of killing people and so forth, has deep roots in the amygdala of the brain. And so war propaganda taps into part of the brain that overwrites the cognitive faculties of the individual. We need to manage our brains and be very wary of when they're trying to manipulate you through this kind of rhetoric. This has to be taken care of. People need to have a conscience and cognitive faculties to overcome this propaganda that's being pummeled at us 24/7. So there's also, I think, an urge on the part of some Americans to have this global empire, this global world order, which is a nightmare, and it's never worked. Everything that's been done to try to attain it has backfired. There's nothing but blowback, and Israel is going to see blowback as well, as they already have.
To James Madison explaining the structure of the federal government under the Constitution and the powers delegated and reserved. Here's how he put it. The powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined, and largest government in history is so far from few and defined, it's almost absurd. They treat it as anything and everything. Madison continued, those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former, those are the federal powers, will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will for the most part be connected. And there's more. He said the powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, well, quick aside, the federal government deals with today, but all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, in the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state, and it can be different from state to state to state. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, because consolidation, one-size-fits-all, is really the footstool. Well, It is the definition of tyranny because you're never going to get things right. And Thomas Jefferson felt that this principle was so important that he felt that he called it the foundation of the Constitution. This is 10 months to the day, February 15, 1791, before the Bill of Rights were ratified. And here's how Jefferson put it in his opinion against the constitutionality of, Alexander Hamilton's National Bank. He said, I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. Now, this should be obvious, and I know I already hinted at this, but the government of very limited delegated powers that James Madison described, that even Hamilton described before ratification, before he flip-flopped, that Jefferson described as the foundation of the Constitution, has absolutely nothing to do with what we have today, the largest and most powerful government in the history of the world. Here's how Mike Maharrey put it in a blog post a few years ago that I like to cite from time to time. He said, one metric we could use to compare the relative size of governments is expenditures. I mean, it's not the only one. He said, based on IMF data, the U.S. government spent $7.66 trillion in 2019. The next closest country in 2019 was China, with outlays of $4.14 trillion. Now, it's not fully double at that point, but if you think about the population numbers, the increase on the U.S. side is so insane. In other words, Mike Maharrey says the United States limited constitutional government spends nearly 8 times per capita than China's, quote, socialist state under the people's democratic dictatorship. So when I talk about facing off against the biggest, most powerful government in the history of the world, I mean it literally. On a macro level, the federal government bullies the world into doing its will. And on a micro level, it interjects itself into virtually every corner of our life. And in many situations, every corner of people's lives in other countries, too. It dictates what kind of plants we can grow in our backyard and how much water we can have in our toilets. Yes, it's true. But things did not get this way overnight. And Jefferson, in that same opinion against Hamilton's National Bank, put it this way. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. James Otis Jr. noted in 1767, writing as freeborn American, which I'm going to cite Otis a bunch going through the rest of this episode here. He pointed out that a free government, now that might be a bit of an oxymoron, but let's go with it. A free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years. Now, we know that people like Thomas Jefferson told us that you're not going to get from despotism to freedom in a featherbed. You're not going to. The ground of liberty, he wrote in 1790, is to be gained by inches because it takes time to convince people even what is for their own good. And that is, liberty. But on the other way around, it's also the same. It does tend to speed up over time, but each step leads to another and another and another. And at one point, John Adams said, it's like a cancer. It eats faster and faster every hour. And that's why so many of the founders and the old revolutionaries recognized that noncompliance and resistance to usurpations of power, to attacks on your liberty was so essential because government isn't just going to back off on violating your rights because you said, well, hey, look at this paper I've got, or these are the rules. You're not following them. As long as people are willing to go along with it, they're going to use that as a precedent. They're going to continue doing it, and they're going to use it as a precedent to expand on that. And that's how Dickinson put it some years earlier, a couple years earlier, in the previous 1765. This is his broadside against the Stamp Act. I don't know why I'm changing the image here, but let's see if I can get it back on the screen. Here we go. He said, if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you fix, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. He continued by saying, if you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. And we see this all around us all the time today. And that's why James Otis Jr., again, in that same essay, writing as Freeborn American, April 27, 1767, it is of the utmost consequence that we boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter and rights. And he put it this way, obsta principiis. If you've been listening to this show or watching it for quite any amount of time, I have cited this Latin phrase a number of times. It basically means nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. And that's how James Otis put it. Obsta principiis is a maxim never to be forgot. If we do not resist at the first attack, it may soon be too late.
As Americans, most people, unfortunately, they still watch the media and they're shown what they're supposed to be shown, whether it's Ukraine, Israel. But let us not forget that our government interferes all over the world. And just because you're not being shown it, and this Venezuela was in and out of the news very quickly, most people I'm sure haven't even heard of it. But let's not forget that our government is the busybody of the world. They're the California and New York of the world, unfortunately. And so Venezuela, that's another country that's has been in the crosshairs, one of the black eyes of the Trump administration. And, relatively speaking, it's a very low bar. He was much better on foreign policy than everyone else, but he did back a coup in Venezuela that failed with Juan Guaido. Some people, I'm sure, will remember that. So that coup failed, and they went with economic sanctions, which are economic war, as we always talk about in this show. And as always, it is the average people of that country that pay for the price, and us too, because we pay for the empire. But yeah, the average Venezuelan suffers from economic sanctions, and that is what has occurred. It's good, I guess, if that some of the sanctions on oil are being removed. That's a good thing. Not all sanctions are being removed, just the ones that are going to help the United States. They want oil, and they had to come up with something, I guess. And apparently, Venezuela is going to hold elections under international supervision. So it's the whole democracy and freedom thing angle. So we'll see how this goes.
Is that all these regulations and do-good movements to spread democracy on the world backfires. And right now, the American people are suffering, and they're going to continue to suffer from it.
Yeah, and this whole freedom and democracy thing, we've heard it so many times. And people, unfortunately, have equated the two, that freedom and democracy are the same. It's not. Democracy is a way of choosing leaders. But I always contend that it's not, the important part is not how leaders are chosen, but what the leaders can do. And that's the important part. In America, our leaders are supposed to follow the law, the supreme law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. They all put their hand up and swear that that's what they're going to do. And unfortunately, it becomes their first official lie while in office because they don't follow it. They only follow it when, they are forced to, and they can't get away with what they want to do. And, so it doesn't really matter how you're choosing your leaders. What matters is, are they going to take away your liberties? Does it matter if it's a democracy, if they're going to take away all your freedom? I say that it doesn't. Before, I'll say 1913, before the income tax, most people didn't even have any connection with the federal government, maybe the post office. But once that income tax and that hand went into every pocket of every person in the country, now everybody's tied to that federal government. And, if the leaders followed the laws, it really wouldn't matter who they were. It wouldn't matter if it's Trump, Biden, Obama, Hillary, because they're following the law. Who cares who they are, what their views are? They have to follow the law. But since they don't, that's a big problem, whether it's a democracy or not. And think about our democracy these days. I don't vote in Republican or Democrat, but I'm an observer, and I see that both sides now don't accept that the other person won. They didn't accept that Trump won. They, claimed Putin pulled the lever for everybody, and Trump also, when Biden won, claims that he didn't win. So what, if you can't even, and that's where it gets dangerous, when neither side will accept that the other won. So that's why this whole democracy equals freedom is a myth. And, obviously, with decade after decade of failed wars bringing democracy to the Middle East and here and there, it all failed. They all just, we go and bomb them and they kick us out because they're sick of us. We should be worrying about our own leaders in our own home following the rules. That would be a much better thing than trying to spread freedom and democracy.
We should stay out of the business of telling other countries how they should run their affairs. And we shouldn't be in these international bodies, whether it's the League of Nations was rejected, the United Nations came in, and let me tell you, you could put a long list of how the United Nations has aggravated things. They didn't prevent a war within a very short period of time. First thing Truman did is says, we're going to war in Korea. Oh, yeah. Oh, you're not allowed to do that. You need a declaration. Oh, no. This is not exactly a war. This is a police action. And it's been on. And just think about how much killing has been going on since World War II because we avoid this whole subject of using the Constitution as a guideline on how we should run our operation. But I believe there's a lot of people waking up. I think COVID backfired on the people who put on the sanctions because the American people are wary of that and they know what could come again. So in the same way with the inflation. But there's a lot of ignorance out there too because they've been pumped up with propaganda coming out of our universities and the establishment, and believe me, people respond to being scared and intimidated, and that's what our government does: scare them to death. That's right, and make them fearful, and they will obey. And if you don't do it, call them unpatriotic. If they won't go along with the wars, if you don't send money to every country, both sides of all the wars, then you're unpatriotic. You're not defending our interests. Well, I know how to defend our interests, whether it's personal taxes of the individual or us as a country. It's just mind our own business. We don't need to be the policemen of the world. And even in recent years, presidents have run on that issue. We shouldn't be the policemen of the world. And yet, when they get in office, that's exactly what they want to do. So I think we know what the ideal is. The founders knew about it. We have a guideline. All I want to do is encourage people to look seriously at a non-interventionist society in the area of economics, personal liberty, and in foreign policy. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.